a king actually locked up his perfectly legal wife in a convent for nearly 2 decades, just because he didn't like her, then married someone else anyway, defying the Pope himself. Another ruler, a powerful duke, just straight up kidnapped the wife of one of his own vassals and moved her into his palace as his main squeeze, while his actual wife could only watch in horror and appeal to the church. Then there was the Empress, who publicly accused her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor no less, of forcing her into depraved sex parties and even trying to make her marry his own son while she was still wed to him. And picture this. A countess tried to juggle 2 powerful husbands in different countries at the same time, sparking international incidents and even a war because nobody could agree on who her real husband was. One young king even married his own stepmother, his father's widow, right after his dad died, sending the brand new Christian church in his kingdom into a total meltdown. Number 9. The king, who married his stepmom and nearly broke Christianity. Okay, so picture this. It's the early 7th century in Anglo-Saxon England, specifically the Kingdom of Kent. Christianity is super new there, like fresh off the boat with missionaries from Rome. The old King Eadbald had converted, which was a huge deal, and things were looking up for the new faith. But then, in 616 AD, Eadbald died all. His son, Eadbald, took the throne. And one of the first things Eadbald did was cause a massive scandal that made the church leaders totally freak out. He married his stepmother. Yes, you read that right. His father's widow. Now, in some pre-Christian traditions, this might not have been such a shocker, perhaps seen as a way to keep the kingdom stable or the queenly influence within the family. But for the brand new Christian church, this was a huge no. It was considered incest, plain and simple. On top of that, Eadbald wasn't exactly enthusiastic about Christianity at first. He actually ditched the new religion when he became king, going back to pagan ways. So you have a pagan king marrying his stepmother, and the tiny Christian community in Kent, led by Archbishop Lawrence, who had taken over from Augustine, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, was tearing its hair out. This was not good for business, spiritually speaking. Bede, a famous monk and historian, writing about a century later, tells us that this marriage was a grievous offense. So grievous, in fact, that some of the missionaries who had come to England with Augustine seriously considered packing their bags and heading back to the continent. Justus, the Bishop of Rochester, and Mellitus, the Bishop of London, actually did flee to Gaul, modern-day France, thinking the whole Christian project in England was doomed. Archbishop Lawrence himself was reportedly on the verge of leaving too. Legend has it that he had a dream where St. Peter appeared, gave him a good scolding and even a whipping for thinking of abandoning his flock. Whether you believe the dream or not, Lawrence decided to stay and confront King Eadbald. We don't know exactly what convinced Eadbald, whether it was Lawrence's arguments, political expediency, a genuine change of heart, or maybe even some divine intervention, as the stories later claimed. But eventually, Eadbald had a major turnaround. He renounced his pagan beliefs and embraced Christianity. And, crucially, he agreed to give up his marriage to his stepmother. The sources don't name her, which is pretty common for women in historical records from this time. Sadly, once he was back in the Christian fold and had ended the controversial marriage, Eadbald then married a woman named Wame, who was possibly a Frankish princess. This marriage was all above board, church approved, and helped to restabilize the Christian church in Kent. With Eadbald, now a Christian king with a Christian wife, or at least a wife approved by the Christian authorities, the missionaries felt it was safe to return, and the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons could get back on track. It was a close call, though. A royal marriage choice nearly derailed the spread of a whole religion in a country. Imagine the gossip. Did you hear about the king and his stepmother? It must have been the talk of the kingdom. Number 8. The king, his wife, his mistress, and the pope, who said absolutely not. Get ready for some 9th century royal drama that had popes, kings, and councils all tied up in knots for years. Meet Lothair II, King of Lotharingia, a chunk of land that covered parts of modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and France. Around 855 AD, Lothair II married a noblewoman named Theutberga. Sounds straightforward. Right, wrong. It seems Lothair wasn't actually that into the Theutberga. His heart, or at least his serious attention, was set on another woman, Waldrada. Waldrada might have even been his mistress before he married the Theutberga. Some historians think Lothair was pressured into marrying Theutberga for political reasons, perhaps because her brother was a very powerful duke named Rupert. So, Lothair had a wife he didn't want and a mistress he very much did. What's a medieval king to do? Try to get rid of the wife, of course. Lothair started accusing Theutberga of some pretty wild things. The main accusation was that she had committed incest with her own brother Hucbert before their marriage, and had even aborted a child conceived from this supposed union. Yikes. These were incredibly serious charges, designed to make her marriage to Lothair invalid from the start. The Theutberga, understandably, denied everything. She even underwent a trial by ordeal, specifically the ordeal of boiling water, to prove her innocence, and she passed. According to the customs of the time, this meant God had declared her innocent. But Lothair was not giving up. He leaned on his local bishops, and in 860 AD, a synod, a church council, at Aachen, likely under royal pressure, found the Theutberga guilty anyway and allowed Lothair to put her in a convent. He then tried to get another synod in 862 AD to allow him to marry Waldrada. The synod also at Aachen did just that, and Lothair promptly married Waldrada, who was even crowned queen. But hold on, Pope Nicholas I in Rome was not having any of it. The Pope was a big believer in the sanctity of marriage, and also in papal authority over kings and local bishops. He got wind of what was happening, investigated, and declared the Aachen synods totally out of line. He said that Theutberga was the rightful wife and queen, and Lothair's marriage to Waldrada was null and void. He excommunicated Waldrada and deposed the archbishops who had supported Lothair's dodgy annulment and remarriage. This kicked off a massive standoff. Lothair, backed by his powerful relatives, including emperors and kings of West and East Francia, tried to resist. He even sent troops to Rome at one point. Theutberga, meanwhile, was in a terrible position, sometimes pressured into confessing she was guilty just to end the ordeal, other times appealing to the Pope for protection. Pope Nicholas I stood firm. Lothair had to take Theutberga back. Eventually, under immense pressure, Lothair sort of caved in 865 AD and officially reinstated the Theutberga as his wife and queen. Waldrada was sent away, at least for a while, but Lothair still didn't give up on Waldrada. He kept trying to get the Pope, and then the next Pope, Adrian II, to grant him a proper divorce. He even traveled to Italy in 869 AD to plead his case in person with Pope Adrian II. The Pope seemed a bit more lenient, or at least willing to reconsider, but before any final decision could be made, Lothair II died suddenly on his way back north. Talk about an abrupt ending. Because he had no legitimate children with Theutberga, and any children with Waldrada were deemed illegitimate by the church. His kingdom of Lotharingia was carved up by his uncles, the kings of East and West Francia. The whole saga shows just how seriously the church took marriage, even for kings, and how a king trying to be married to two women, one officially, one in his heart, and then briefly officially, could cause an international crisis. Number 7. The pious king, his cousin wife, and an excommunication drama. Let's hop over to France around the turn of the millennium, the late 10th and early 11th centuries. We're talking about King Robert II, known as Robert the Pious. You'd think a king nicknamed the Pious would be a stickler for church rules, right? Well, when it came to his love life, things got complicated. Robert's first marriage was to Rosala of Italy, also known as Susanna of Italy, around 988 AD. She was quite a bit older than him and was the widow of Arnulf II, Count of Flanders. This marriage was more about politics than passion. It brought Robert the important territory of Montreuil and a claim to the county of Flanders. But Robert wasn't happy. Rosala was older, and they didn't have any children. So after his father, Hugh Capet, the first Capetian king of France, died in 996 AD, Robert decided he wanted out. He repudiated Rolla, basically just sent her away, though he kept Montreuil. Now Robert had his eye on someone else, Bertha of Burgundy. Bertha was the widow of Odo, Count of Blois, and Robert seems to have genuinely been in love with her. There was just one tiny problem. Actually, two. First, Bertha was Robert's cousin. They were related within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity, meaning they were too closely related by blood, according to church law at the time. Second, Robert had been the godfather to one of Bertha's children from her previous marriage. In the eyes of the church, this created a spiritual affinity, or spiritual relationship, that also made marriage between them a no-go. But Robert, pious or not, was determined. Around 996 or 997 AD, he went ahead and married Bertha anyway. This was in direct defiance of Pope Gregory V, who had warned them against it. The Pope was not amused. He declared the marriage illegal and demanded they separate. When Robert and Bertha refused, Pope Gregory V excommunicated both of them in 998 AD. Excommunication was a huge deal. It meant they were cut off from the church, couldn't receive sacraments, and theoretically their subjects didn't have to obey them anymore. France was also placed under an interdict, meaning church services couldn't be publicly celebrated in the kingdom. Imagine your whole country being spiritually punished because the king insisted on marrying his cousin. For several years, Robert and Bertha lived together as husband and wife, despite the papal ban. It's said that they were deeply devoted to each other. However, the political and religious pressure was immense. Also, they had a son who was born with some kind of deformity, which some at the time might have interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure with the union. Eventually, Robert couldn't hold out any longer. Around 1001 or 1003 AD, he finally agreed to separate from Bertha. It must have been a heartbreaking decision for them. The excommunication was lifted. Robert then needed another wife and a legitimate heir. So, in 1003 AD, he married Constance of Arles. This marriage was apparently much less happy. Constance was described as a difficult and shrewish woman, but it did produce the heirs Robert needed, including the future King Henry I of France. Bertha seems to have faded into the background, though some sources suggest Robert might have still held a lingering affection for her, and perhaps even tried to get his marriage to Constance annulled later on so he could go back to Bertha, but it never happened. So, for a significant period, King Robert II was, in the eyes of the Church, bigamously, or at least unlawfully, married to Bertha while his first wife Rosala was still alive, though repudiated and without proper church sanction for his second union. His piety clearly had its limits when love was involved. Number 6. The king who stole another man's wife and got away with it. This story from late 11th and early 12th century France is juicy. It involves King Philip I of France, a man known more for his scandals than his kingly deeds. Philip was already married to Bertha of Holland. They had been married since about 1072 AD, and even had a son, Louis, the future king, Louis VI. But as the years went by, Philip apparently got bored with Bertha. Sources say, he complained, she was too fat. Ouch. Around 1092 AD, Philip did something truly audacious. He repudiated Bertha, basically packed her off to a castle in Montreuil-sur-Mer, which, ironically, was her own dower property. And then he set his sights on Bertrade de Montfort. Now, Bertrade was no ordinary single lady. She was already married to Fulk IV. I'll reckon. The surly, the quarrelsome, or the rude, take your pick, the powerful Count of Anjou. And she had children with Fulk. Did that stop King Philip? Not a chance. He essentially abducted Bertrade, though some chronicles hint she might have been a willing participant in her own abduction. Whether she went willingly or not, Philip married her. Yes, he married a woman who was already married to someone else, while his own first wife was still alive, and very much not divorced in the eyes of the Church. This was double trouble. Bigamy for Philip, and bigamy and adultery for Bertrade. You can imagine the outrage. Fulk of Anjou was furious, obviously. The Church was absolutely scandalized. Bishop Ivo of Chartres, a very respected legal scholar, strongly condemned the marriage and refused to attend the wedding ceremony, which some more compliant bishop was found to perform. Pope Urban II, the same pope who launched the First Crusade, got involved. He excommunicated King Philip in 1094 AD at a council in Autun, and then again at the very important Council of Clermont in 1095 AD. Yes, the same council where he called for the crusade. So, while preaching a holy war, the Pope also had to deal with a French king living in open sin. The excommunication meant Philip was technically an outcast. He couldn't participate in religious services, and his political authority was weakened. Did Philip immediately repent and send Bertrade back to Folk? Nope. He and Bertrade continued to live together as husband and wife for years. There were periods where Philip would promise to separate from Bertrade to get the excommunication lifted, especially when he needed the church's support, or when things got too politically hot. He'd make a show of repentance. The ban would be temporarily lifted, and then he'd go right back to living with Bertrade. This happened multiple times. It was a cycle of sin, fate, repentance, and more sin. Bertha of Holland, Philip's first wife, died in 1094 AD. This simplified things slightly for Philip. At least he wasn't technically keeping two wives alive simultaneously anymore. But Bertrade was still married to Fulk of Anjou. Fulk, for his part, seems to have eventually, grudgingly, accepted the situation, or perhaps was paid off, or politically outmaneuvered. Sources are a bit murky on how his opposition ended, but he never got Bertrade back. Philip and Bertrade had several children together, whose legitimacy was of course questionable for a long time. Finally, around 1104 AD, Philip made a more public and seemingly sincere vow to give up Bertrade, though it's debatable if they ever truly separated entirely in private. The excommunication was lifted for good. By this time, they had been together for over a decade. Philip I died in 1108 AD, and Bertrade, after his death, actually retired to a convent. What a twist! The whole affair shows a king so determined to have the woman he wanted, who was already married, that he was willing to defy the Pope, endure excommunication, and cause a kingdom-wide scandal for years on end. And he pretty much got away with it. Number 5. The Duke who paraded his married mistress and drove his wife to a convent. Let's talk about William IX, Duke of Aquitaine and Gascony, and also Count of Poitou. He lived from the late 11th to the early 12th century and is famous for a few things, being one of the first vernacular poets, a troubadour, leading a disastrous crusade, and, you guessed it, his scandalous love life. William IX had 2 wives in succession. His first marriage was to Ermengarde of Anjou, which was annulled. Then, around 1094 AD, he married Philippa of Toulouse. Philippa was the daughter of the Count of Toulouse, and brought with her a claim to that important county, which William was very keen on. They had several children, including William X of Aquitaine, father of the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Raymond of Poitiers, who became Prince of Antioch. So far, so good. Right? A powerful duke, a politically advantageous marriage, heirs being produced. But William IX was, shall we say, a man of considerable appetites and not much self-restraint. He was notorious for his affairs, and one affair in particular caused an epic scandal. The lady in question was Aimauberge, known as Dangerosa, or Dangereuse, de Lisle Bouchard. And here's the kicker. Dangerosa was the wife of one of William's own vassals, Aimery I, Viscount of Châtellerault. Around 1115 AD, William IX essentially abducted Dangerosa, though, like with Bertrade de Montfort, there are strong suggestions she was a more than willing participant. He didn't just have a quiet affair with her. Oh no. William installed Dangerosa in the Montbergen Tower in his palace in Poitiers. He lived with her openly, parading her as his mistress, while his actual wife, Duchess Philippa, was still around. Imagine being Duchess Philippa. Your husband, the Duke, brings his mistress, the wife of one of his own noblemen, to live in your palace, in a tower practically named after her. Montbergen for a Malberge Dangerosa. The humiliation must have been immense. Philippa was reportedly horrified and deeply distressed. She appealed to her friends, to the church, to anyone who would listen. The church was not amused. Papal legates, representatives of the Pope, condemned William's actions. Bishop Peter II of Poitiers bravely confronted Duke William, ordering him to send Dangerosa back to her husband. William's response. According to one chronicler, William, who was, remember, a poet with a sharp wit, threatened the bishop, supposedly saying something like, "I'll sooner curl your hair with my sword than send away the Viscountess." The bishop then began the rite of excommunication. William, unfazed, drew his sword and threatened to kill him. The bishop, showing incredible courage, offered his neck and told William to strike. William, perhaps taken aback or just not wanting to murder a bishop in cold blood, supposedly quipped, "No, I don't love you enough to send you to paradise." Despite the bravado, William was excommunicated. This was a serious punishment, but William, much like Philip I of France, seemed to wear it pretty lightly for a while. He continued to live with Dangerosa. The situation was so unbearable for Duchess Philippa that in 1116 AD she retreated to the Fontefraud Abbey, a famous religious community that welcomed both men and women, including disgraced queens and noblewomen. She died there a couple of years later. So, for a time, William IX was living openly with Dangerosa, while still married to Philippa, making him a de facto bigamist in the eyes of many. Certainly an adulterer on a grand scale. Dangerosa herself was also committing adultery, having abandoned her husband. Interestingly, Dangerosa's daughter, Énor de Châtellerault, from her marriage to Aimery, would later marry William IX's son, William X. This meant that William IX's son married the daughter of his father's long-term notorious mistress. And their daughter was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, the scandal was literally in the family tree of one of Europe's most powerful women. William IX eventually reconciled with the church before his death, but his scandalous affair with Dangerosa and his defiance of religious authorities became legendary. He was a larger-than-life character whose love life was as dramatic as his poetry. Number 4. The Empress who accused her husband of wild orgies and worse. This is a shocking one, even by medieval scandal standards. We're talking about Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, who reigned in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. He's already famous for the investiture controversy, that massive power struggle with Pope Gregory VII, where Henry supposedly stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa begging for forgiveness. But his marital life was just as tumultuous, especially with his second wife. Henry's first wife was Bertha of Savoy. Their marriage seems to have been rocky at first. He even tried to divorce her early on, but they eventually reconciled and had several children, including his heir Conrad. Bertha died in 1087. 2 years later, in 1089, Henry IV married again. His new bride was Euphraxia of Kiev, a Russ's princess, who took the name Adelheid, or Adelaide, upon her marriage. She was young, beautiful, and came from an important royal family. This marriage was likely intended to secure an alliance and produce more heirs. But it turned into an absolute nightmare, at least according to Adelheid. Things went south very quickly. By 1093, Adelheid had fled from her husband and sought refuge with Matilda of Tuscany, one of Henry IV's most powerful enemies and a staunch supporter of the Pope. What happened next was explosive. In 1094, Adelheid appeared before church councils, including one at Constance and another at Piacenza in 1095, where Pope Urban II was also present, busy with the First Crusade preparations, and King Philip I of France's bigamy. At these councils, Adelheid made a series of horrifying public accusations against Henry IV. She claimed that Henry had forced her to participate in orgies. She said he had offered her up to other men, including his own son, Conrad, from his first marriage to Bertha. She even accused Henry of trying to make her son, Conrad, commit incest with her, his stepmother. According to some accounts, she also claimed Henry belonged to a heretical sect that practiced these debaucheries as part of their rituals. She stated that she had been held prisoner by Henry after she refused these demands. These accusations were beyond scandalous. They were reputation-destroying. Imagine an empress publicly detailing such abuse and perversion by the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Whether all her claims were true, exaggerated for political reasons, or a mixture of both, they caused a massive sensation and deeply damaged Henry IV's standing. His son, Conrad, was so horrified by his father's alleged treatment of Adelheid, and perhaps by the attempts to involve him, that he rebelled against Henry IV in 1093 and joined the papal party. Pope Urban II took Adelheid's side. He accepted her testimony, declared her free from Henry, and granted her an annulment or recognized their separation, effectively saying she was no longer bound to him due to his monstrous behavior. Adelheid never returned to Henry. She eventually went back to Kiev and became a nun, dying in 1109. Henry IV, for his part, denied the accusations, dismissing them as slander spread by his enemies. But the damage was done. The scandal, combined with his ongoing conflicts with the papacy and rebellions by his sons, first Conrad, then the future Henry V, plagued the rest of his reign. While this isn't a straightforward case of Henry IV trying to have two legal wives simultaneously in the same way as some other kings, it's a case where his wife accused him of such heinous marital abuses, including attempting to force her into bigamous or incestuous relationships, that the Church essentially dissolved their union. The sheer public nature and shocking content of Adelheid's accusations make it one of the most infamous marital scandals of the entire medieval period. It painted a picture of an emperor not just as a political opponent of the Pope, but as a moral monster. Number 3. The king with so many wives, it's hard to keep track. Let's journey to Spain, to the kingdom of Leon and Castile, in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. King Alfonso VI, known as the Brave, was a major figure in the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to push Muslim rulers out of the Iberian Peninsula. He was a powerful and successful king, but his marital history was, to put it mildly, complex and a bit messy, leading to questions about legitimacy and succession that would echo for generations. Alfonso VI had at least 5 wives, and possibly a couple of significant mistresses who were treated almost like wives. Keeping them all straight and figuring out when one marriage ended and another began, and whether all the annulments were truly valid, is a historian's puzzle. His first wife was Agnes of Aquitaine. They married around 1069 or 1074. They had no surviving children, and the marriage was eventually annulled, likely on grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related. Then, around 1080, Alfonso married Constance of Burgundy. This was a very important marriage, linking him to a powerful French ducal house, and bringing Cluniac, a reformed Benedictine order influence, to Spain. Constance gave Alfonso a daughter, Urraca, who would eventually become queen in her own right and have her own set of marital dramas. Constance died in 1093. Before, during, or after these marriages, Alfonso also had significant relationships with other women. One very important one was with a noblewoman named Jimena Muñoz. She was his concubine, a long-term recognized mistress, and bore him 2 daughters, Elvira and Teresa, who made important marriages. The status of children from such unions was always a bit precarious. After Constance's death, Alfonso's marital carousel really got spinning. Around 1093 or 1094 he married Bertha, whose origins are a bit debated, possibly from Tuscany or Burgundy. She died childless, around 1099 or 1100. Next up, around 1100, Alfonso married Isabel. The identity of this Isabel is a huge historical debate. Some scholars believe she was the same person as Zaida of Seville, a Muslim princess who was Alfonso's mistress, converted to Christianity, and took the name Isabel. Zaida Isabel bore Alfonso his only son, Sancho Alfonsis, who became his heir apparent. If Isabel was indeed the converted Zaida, marrying a former mistress and a converted Muslim princess would have been quite a statement. Others think Isabel was a different French noblewoman. Regardless of this, Isabel died around 1107. If Isabel was Zaida, it highlights the complex intermingling of Christian and Muslim nobilities in Spain at the time, and how personal relationships could cross religious divides, sometimes leading to formal marriages. After Isabel's death, Alfonso, now quite elderly, married again. Around 1108, he married Beatrice of Este, or possibly another French noblewoman also named Beatrice. He died in 1109, so this marriage was very short. The big problem with all these sequential marriages and the concubinage was the constant question of legitimacy for his children, especially his only son Sancho, born to Zaida Isabel. While Sancho was recognized as Alfonso's heir, his death in battle in 1108 before his father threw the succession into crisis. It passed to Alfonso's eldest legitimate daughter, Urraca. The sheer number of wives, the annulments, the influential mistresses, and the questions surrounding the status of some of these unions and their offspring created an atmosphere where accusations of impropriety or even de facto bigamy, if an annulment wasn't universally accepted before a remarriage, could easily arise. For example, If the grounds for annulling his marriage to Agnes were later disputed, it could cast a shadow over his subsequent marriage to Constance. While Alfonso VI wasn't excommunicated for bigamy, like some other kings, the rapid succession of wives and the prominent role of mistresses whose children were sometimes preferred over those from canonical marriages made his court a hotbed of potential scandal and succession disputes. His complex love life certainly kept people talking and church lawyers busy. Number 2. The king, his hated Danish bride, and the Pope's fury. This is one of the most famous royal marital messes in all of medieval history, a true saga of a king who just really didn't want to be married to his wife. We're talking about King Philip II, Augustus of France, a hugely important and powerful king who reigned from 1180 to 1223. He expanded French territory, strengthened royal power, and went on the Third Crusade. But his love life, a total disaster zone that led to a major clash with one of the most powerful popes ever, Innocent III. In 1193, Philip, recently widowed from his first wife, Isabel of Hainaut, who had given him his heir, Louis, decided to marry Ingeborg of Denmark. She was the sister of King Canute, the Sixth of Denmark. The marriage was politically motivated. Philip was probably looking for Danish naval support against England and a connection to the old Danish claims to the English throne. Ingeborg also came, with a hefty dowry. So, Ingeborg sailed to France, and they were married in Amiens on August 14th, 1193. She was crowned queen the next day. And then, literally, the very next day after the coronation, Philip freaked out. For reasons that have never been entirely clear, though theories range from her having bad breath to a sudden physical repulsion to her not being docile enough to pre-contract anxieties, Philip decided he couldn't stand Ingeborg and wanted the marriage annulled immediately. He tried to pack Ingeborg off back to Denmark, but she, understandably, refused to go. She insisted she was his lawful wife and Queen of France, and she didn't even speak French to argue her case properly at first. Philip convened an assembly of his nobles and bishops, who dutifully declared the marriage null and void, claiming some obscure impediment of affinity, a distant blood relationship that supposedly hadn't been disclosed. Ingeborg wasn't having it. She appealed directly to Rome, to Pope Celestine III. She learned French, wrote letters, and maintained her claim with incredible stubbornness and dignity. Meanwhile, Philip, considering himself a free man, shut Ingeborg away. She was basically imprisoned, moved from convent to dreary castle, often kept in harsh conditions, short of food and comforts, and isolated for nearly 2 decades. Then, in June 1196, despite his marriage to Ingeborg not being annulled by the Pope, who was dragging his feet or leaning towards Ingeborg's side, Philip went ahead and married again, this time to Agnes of Merania, a German noblewoman he seems to have genuinely fallen in love with. So now, in the eyes of the Church and much of Europe, King Philip II was a bigamist. He had one wife, Ingeborg, locked up, and another, Agnes, by his side and sharing his bed. When Pope Innocent III came to the papal throne in 1198, he was a much more formidable figure than Celestine III. Innocent was a strong believer in papal supremacy and the sanctity of marriage. He took up Ingeborg's cause with vigor. He demanded that Philip take Ingeborg back and send Agnes away. Philip refused, So, in 1200, Pope Innocent III did something drastic. He placed the entire Kingdom of France under an interdict. This meant no church services, except baptisms for infants and last rites for the dying, could be performed publicly. No masses, no marriages in church, no Christian burials in consecrated ground. This was a huge deal, and put immense pressure on Philip from his own people, who feared for their souls. Reluctantly, Philip made a show of separating from Agnes of Merania and acknowledging Ingeborg. The interdict was lifted in late 1200. But Agnes was pregnant with Philip's son, Tristan, and she died in childbirth or shortly after, in 1201. Philip was heartbroken. He even managed to get Pope Innocent III to legitimize his children with Agnes, which was a small victory for him. But the Pope still insisted. Ingeborg was his only true wife. Even though Agnes was dead, Philip still refused to properly reconcile with Ingeborg. He kept her confined, hoping she'd die or agree to a divorce. He tried various legal tricks. Ingeborg, for her part, never wavered. She just kept insisting she was Queen of France. Finally, in 1213, after nearly 20 years of this struggle, Philip suddenly and surprisingly took Ingeborg back as his queen. Why the change of heart? It was probably pure politics. Philip was planning an invasion of England, and he needed all the legitimacy and international goodwill he could get, including good relations with the Pope and Denmark. So, Ingeborg was finally restored to her rightful place. She outlived Philip and was treated with respect after his death. This whole saga was an epic international scandal. A king so desperate to get rid of one wife and keep another that he defied the Pope, plunged his country into religious crisis, and kept his legal queen a prisoner for 2 decades. It's a stark reminder of how personal desires of rulers could clash dramatically with religious and political realities. Samber 1. The Countess, who juggled husbands and sparked a war. Get ready for the queen of complicated medieval marriages, a woman whose romantic and political entanglements were so messy they actually led to wars and involved half the nobility of northwestern Europe. Meet Jacqueline, Countess of Hainaut, Holland and Zeeland, who lived in the tumultuous 15th century. Her life was a whirlwind of husbands, annulment, attempts, and power struggles. Jacqueline inherited vast and very strategic territories in the Low Countries when she was just a teenager, around 1417. This made her a super attractive marriage prospect. And marry she did multiple times. Husband number 1, John Dauphin of France, heir to the French throne. They married when she was young, but he died in 1417, not long after they wed, and possibly before the marriage was even consummated. So far, tragic, but not scandalous. Husband number 2, John IV, Duke of Brabant. Jacqueline married her cousin John of Brabant in 1418. This marriage was a disaster. John was apparently weak and ineffective, and he let Jacqueline's ambitious uncle, John of Bavaria, seize control of much of her inheritance in Holland and Zeeland. Jacqueline was not the type to sit idly by. She felt her husband wasn't protecting her interests, or her. So, what did she do? In 1420, she fled Brabant and made her way to England. There, she sought the help of King Henry V And here's where it gets really juicy. Jacqueline claimed her marriage to John of Brabant was invalid due to consanguinity. They were cousins, and she argued the papal dispensation they'd received wasn't sufficient or had been obtained improperly. While in England, she caught the eye of King Henry V's younger brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, a very powerful and ambitious man. Husband number 3, Sordom Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. In 1422 or 1423, Jacqueline married Humphrey in England. Big problem. She was, according to the Pope and most of Europe, still very much married to John IV of Brabant. John of Brabant had not agreed to an annulment, and the Pope, at the time Martin V, had not granted one. So, Jacqueline was now in the eyes of many a bigamist, and Humphrey had married another man's wife. This was not just a personal scandal. It was an international diplomatic nightmare. Humphrey, eager to claim Jacqueline's lands in her name and his, launched an invasion of Hainaut in 1424. This pitted him against John of Brabant and, more importantly, John's powerful ally and overlord, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Philip the Good was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and he was not happy about an English duke meddling in the Low Countries and trying to snatch these territories. The whole thing turned into a war. Jacqueline and Humphrey had some initial success, but Philip of Burgundy's forces were formidable. Pope Martin V sided with John of Brabant and Philip of Burgundy, confirming that Jacqueline's marriage to John of Brabant was valid, and her marriage to Humphrey was therefore null and void. He even threatened Humphrey and Jacqueline with excommunication. Things went badly for Jacqueline and Humphrey. Humphrey, perhaps realizing it was a losing battle or more interested in English politics, eventually abandoned Jacqueline and returned to England in 1425. He later got his own marriage to Jacqueline annulled, on the grounds that her marriage to John of Brabant was still valid, ironic, right, and married one of his own mistresses. Poor Jacqueline was left to fend for herself. She was captured by Burgundian forces and imprisoned in Ghent. She managed a daring escape, disguised as a man according to legend, and tried to continue the fight for her lands. But eventually, she was forced to come to terms with Philip of Burgundy. In the reconciliation of Delft in 1428, she had to acknowledge Philip as her heir and regent of her territories, and she promised not to marry again without his consent. Her husband, John of Brabant, had died in 1427, which at least cleared up the bigamy issue. Husband number 4, Frank van Borsel. For a while, Jacqueline lived under Burgundian control, but she fell in love with a powerful Zeeland nobleman, Frank van Borsel. They secretly married around 1432. When Philip of Burgundy found out, he was furious because she hadn't gotten his permission. He imprisoned Frank. To save him, Jacqueline had to make a final, heartbreaking choice. In 1433, in the Treaty of The Hague, she formally abdicated all her titles and lands in favor of Philip the Good. In return, Philip allowed her to marry Frank and live out her life with him, though without her former power and status. Jacqueline died just a few years later in 1436 from tuberculosis, still in her 30s. Her life was a dramatic illustration of how the personal and political were intertwined for high-ranking women, and how attempts to control their own marital destinies, especially when it involved multiple disputed marriages, could lead to scandal, war, and the loss of everything. She tried to have 2 husbands at once, and it cost her an entire inheritance. What a story!